When I went to Epic Universe, the one land I was the most excited for was the Dark Universe. Out of all the lands at Epic, this felt like the one that was catering to me the most. I have no attachment to Harry Potter. Nintendo games I never really played. How to Train Your Dragon, I'll get around to that franchise eventually. But the Universal Classic Monsters, that was something I was more familiar with. And the horror niche as a whole is something I'm quite passionate for. So when I first walked into Epic Universe, I knew that this was my first go-to. I had to witness the Dark Universe as my first impression. However, that didn't exactly happen. I ended up going to Super Nintendo World for early entry and waited about an hour for Mario Kart, but right after that, I was there. I walked straight into Darkmoor, and I got on Monsters Unchained, the Frankenstein experiment. And oh, Universal, how did you do so well? Every animatronic was functioning, they were all fluid. Some of these creatures, they can be legitimately terrifying to someone who's not acquainted with the horror genre. Universal, I'm thoroughly impressed with what you were able to do with this ride. However, the land itself, Darkmoor, I've got some notes. Like I said, not even a minute ago, when I walked into Epic Universe, I thought that this land was going to be my favorite, that it was going to stand tall among the rest. And as much as I hate to say it, it wasn't. Not by a long shot. Actually, the Dark Universe is probably my third favorite land at Epic. Yeah, second to last. How about that? Originally, I anticipated this to be number 1, Harry Potter number 2, Nintendo 3, How to Train Your Dragon 4. But now that I've experienced the park, my order has completely shifted. Now Nintendo is my number 1, followed by How to Train Your Dragon, then Dark Universe, then Harry Potter. Sorry, Harry Potter, nothing against you personally. I think the 1920s Paris land does look good, but I didn't get on Ministry, so I'm still salty towards ya, Harry Potter. When examining the Dark Universe, even though this land does feature my favorite ride in the park with Frankenstein, the rest of the land, on the other hand, it doesn't measure up in my eyes. So what is exactly wrong with the Dark Universe? Well, this land, it's got a few glaring issues, but I think the biggest one is that it's too tiny. Dark Universe is not a full package. This land does not have a lot to it. When I walk into every other land at Epic, I can see all the massive buildings, the incredible superstructures and scope that envelops the entire area. But when it comes to Darkmoor, you don't exactly get that. Once you get past your first impression of the Darkmoor town, with the village and Frankenstein's castle at the end of the midway, the land suddenly starts to taper off. Of course, there is the burning windmill just ahead, but it's kind of in its own little world. It's on the outskirts of town, and the Curse of the Werewolf roller coaster kind of takes all of your attention away. If what I saw in the first half of the land was the entire land, then I would have no complaints. Darkmoor would feel complete. Instead, the entire land feels like it just houses a castle, a tavern, and a steakhouse, with a roller coaster as the main focal point. In my opinion, I think the Curse of the Werewolf roller coaster was a big mistake for the Dark Universe. Big mistake. It is an eyesore for the land, and it takes up half of the land, even though the roller coaster itself is objectively a short ride. Yes, this ride is a perfectly suitable family coaster. A lot of kids are gonna love this thing, but that's not enough reason to ignore the cons with this coaster. So in this land, you got the Darkmoor village, and then just a roller coaster sitting right next to it, and it's extremely out of place. They've dressed it up the best they can, with the station and the shed that you thread through during the ride, but I can't help but feel that this would have been better as an indoor coaster. Universal, could you have put this entire ride in a box with the Darkmoor gothic buildings and facades around it? That would have been better execution. I wish you would have done that. Even if the Curse of the Werewolf coaster is here to stay, that doesn't mean that the Dark Universe will always feel incomplete. This land is a prime contender for an expansion. Out of all the lands in this park, this one feels the most worthy for growth. Universal, I feel like when you were constructing this land, you were a little hesitant on giving it enough room to breathe. But now that Frankenstein is open and we see that it's an unmitigated success, you should have all the confidence in the world. And when the time is right, you'll know what to do. You know that expanding Dark Universe is the correct move. But before Universal can even consider adding a few more residents to Darkmoor, we first have to address the elephant in the room. How would you even expand the Dark Universe. Not only in terms of IP, like what other properties would you even install in Darkmoor, but also where would Universal even expand the Dark Universe? Unfortunately, Darkmoor, it sits at the back of Epic, and it's squeezed between a road and the pool of the Helios Grand Hotel. So the land, it's kind of boxed into a corner. So the only way you can realistically expand the Dark Universe is by moving in on this generous plot of land right next to it. Seems pretty convenient, right? The only issue, however, is that this land is also next to Super Nintendo World. And Super Nintendo World is also rumored for an expansion one day. Everyone knows Universal, they're just itching to build a Zelda land. I mean, it's only fitting. They do have access to all the Nintendo properties, and Zelda is a pretty popular franchise. It's a match made in heaven. All Universal has to do is figure out where to put this land. And looky here, a plot of land right next to Mario and Donkey Kong. It's perfect, the stars have aligned, everything can be right there in one location. However, if they do this, they're gonna encroach on the Dark Universe. How can they expand Darkmoor if there's nowhere to build? Theoretically, I suppose if Universal wanted to, they could split this land in half and give one side to Nintendo and one side to Darkmoor. And if we account for this little unicorn strip right by the tavern and the show building for Frankenstein, then I suppose that the Darkmoor expansion and Zelda can coexist. This land does appear to be big enough. In fact, if they wanted to, they could put another portal land here instead of just 2 sub-lands. It's just a matter of, would Universal really do this? Would they divide the space for 2 smaller lands? Or would they want to go for 1 massive land? I think it all comes down to whether or not Universal, they want to cut their potential in half, or do they want to seize opportunity and utilize all the land that they're given? Realistically, this is all dependent on how ambitious Universal is feeling. The only reason why I'm unsure about Universal splitting the land in half is because we keep hearing rumors about Zelda replacing the Lost Continent at Islands of Adventure. Let me be clear, I do not want this to happen. I do not want Zelda to replace the Lost Continent. I don't want anything to replace the Lost Continent, but I know that's not going to happen. This land's future, it is completely up in the air, and everyone keeps saying, Zelda, Zelda, Zelda. Wouldn't it seem more plausible to put the Legend of Zelda land right next to the other Nintendo properties? I think so. I think it would. But as always, there's a reason for everything. There's a reason why Universal is considering putting Zelda at Islands. Money. Think about it. Super Nintendo World, it's not just a land. It's an interactive experience. Everything within the land has some kind of gimmick to it. You're supposed to engage with Super Nintendo World. When you enter the land, you have the option to buy a wristband, and this wristband allows you to play and interact with all the oddities the land has to offer, effectively making Super Nintendo World one large upcharge attraction. And this is a very lucrative business practice for Universal. I mean, just look at the Wizarding World of Harry Potter. Those lands are basically upcharges. You buy a $100 wand, you wave it around, and you can make anything within the land come to life. The only difference with Nintendo is that you get a wristband instead of a wand. Now, Universal, they could carry out the same interactivity within a Zelda land within Epic Universe, or they can take it to Islands. That way, the interactive wristband isn't exclusive to Epic Universe. This way, you can use your wristband within 2 parks instead of 1, thus adding to the wristband's value. So if you're hesitant on buying a wristband at Super Nintendo World because, it only works here, it only works at Epic, you can't use it at any of the other parks, so it's probably gonna go to waste after a day. But if they build Zelda at Islands, that will no longer be the case. So tourists would be more willing to buy. If this is Universal's thought process for building a Zelda land at Islands over Epic, then suddenly all the land over here would become exclusively available to the Dark Universe. And that would mean the sky would be the limit. They can do as much as they want in the Dark Universe, and this could subsequently become the biggest land at Epic. Am I getting a bit ahead of myself? Well, yeah, I am. It's all wishful thinking at the end of the day. But let's say this was the case, and Universal, they had all the space they desired for Darkmoor. What would they even put in the land? What IPs would they integrate? Shall Universal continue using the classic monsters, or would they take a step back and build rides around modern horror? Horror is a massive genre. There is a lot they can pull from. So what IPs or franchises can sensibly work within Darkmoor, or could work within a subland within the Dark Universe? Well, it all comes down to setting. The only horror movies that will be considered are the ones with a great location. Where do they take place? How detailed is the world building? Can you realistically harvest enough from the IP to fill a 5 to 10 acre plot of land? If we are going to go down the modern horror route, then it's going to be a little tricky, because most horror movies from today, or back in the 80s, they don't have enough material to pull from to fulfill a land. The horror genre, it is a lot of things, but a lot of it is bad. There are so many bad horror movies out there. Because horror movies are so cheap to produce, that creates an influx in the market. So that means there are a lot of horror movies out there, but the majority of them are terrible. And the ones that are good, the diamonds in the rough, again, they don't have a lot of story to adapt. For instance, if I focus on my favorite horror movies from the last 10 years, like It Follows, Hereditary, or Heretic, is there any scenario where I would want to see a ride from these movies? No, I don't. These movies are pretty finite in their own universe. There's not much more you can do with them. Like, what would you even do with an It Follows ride? You build a church and it teaches you about the dangers of STDs? Ooh, scary. Nah, that wouldn't work for a variety of reasons. Of course, Universal, they could just pull classic characters from horror instead of devoting an entire land to one movie, basically doing the exact same thing they did with Darkmoor. After all, with Monsters Unchained, they didn't just theme it to Frankenstein. They included Dracula, the creature from the Black Lagoon, Phantom of the Opera, mummies. The ride is a melting pot of classic horror. So who's to say they can't do the same thing with modern horror? Like, let's take the Mount Rushmore of iconic horror characters with Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers, and Ghostface, and just give them a ride. Could that work? Could Universal do that? If they get all the licensing agreements, then yes, they can, but would they want to? After all, they already have Monsters Unchained. This ride would be way too similar in premise. All they would do is change out the villains. Not too unique, is it? In my mind, there are only two franchises that are actually worth adapting into a ride or land, and those would be Beetlejuice and Stranger Things. Beetlejuice because the world of the dead is so cool and unique in that movie. Tim Burton really nailed the visuals of the Beetlejuice universe. It's so whimsical yet eerie, abstract yet boring, because the world of the dead is kind of like a DMV. Universal, if you ever built a ride themed to Beetlejuice, all you have to do for the queue is this. This is perfect. The first Beetlejuice movie set the groundwork for the world of the dead, and the second movie expanded upon it, even if the story for the second one was kind of all over the place. And the character of Beetlejuice, he is the best. He's hilarious. Michael Keaton carried these movies even though he was barely in them.
I think it was Dostoevsky who said, "Later, fucker."
Plus, Universal, I feel like this brand would have a lot more mass appeal, because Beetlejuice, it isn't really a horror movie. It's a horror comedy family drama. So if the Monsters Unchained ride becomes a little too scary for a younger demographic, then a ride like Beetlejuice would be a nice complement to it. It's something that's horror adjacent, but it's not an outright scarefest. And Universal, if you for some reason think that the world of Beetlejuice clashes too much with the gothic tone of Darkmoor, then don't worry, I have an easy solution for you. Just build a cemetery, put in a tombstone named Beetlejuice, and then have a neon sign directing you down into the grave. That will be the entrance to the Beetlejuice ride, and then the actual bulk of the ride will be in a show building behind Darkmoor. You can do this if you think the tones of either IP will clash. Other than Beetlejuice, I think the obvious pick would be Stranger Things, just because of the Upside Down alone. This would work well as a subland. Actually, I think the Upside Down would be better if it was an indoor land. That way you can keep the dark and gloomy tones of the Upside Down all throughout the day, compared to Darkmoor, where it's only dark and gloomy at night, and the rest of the time it's bright and sunny because of the Florida weather. So Universal, you can build a Stranger Things land indoors, and then have a ride based on the show with all the terrifying creatures from the Upside Down. Between Beetlejuice and Stranger Things, I do see Stranger Things having a higher likelihood of actually happening, depending on how the final season performs. If for some reason the final season of Stranger Things sucks, then I think the show will completely die off, like how Game of Thrones did. But there you have it. If Universal ever expanded the Dark Universe, Beetlejuice and Stranger Things would be my top picks. So Universal, how about you get on that?